那第二位嘉宾和我们对谈的是 OpenAI 的前研究员，如今从事风险投资行业，是硅谷 Leonis Capital 的合伙人 Jenny 肖。我们的对话以全英文进行。
Hi, Jenny. Great to have you with us today.
Well, thanks for having me again. Really excited to be back on Silicon Valley 101.
Great. So my first question is that how does Silicon Valley see DeepSeek's V4 release? Anything surprised you this time?
Yeah, I would say DeepSeek V3 and also DeepSeek R1 was definitely the defining moment for Silicon Valley. Like early last year, a lot of people in Silicon Valley said we had a DeepSeek moment because at that time, very few Silicon Valley people believe that China has the capability to train a frontier model. I would say the reaction to DeepSeek V4 is still happening in real time, but I think the scale of the reaction is definitely less intense compared to the last DeepSeek release. And I think even in China, the reaction is a lot less intense compared to the previous release. However, I think Silicon Valley views DeepSeek V4 as, like a really great engineering breakthrough, especially the efficiency gains. I think the Chinese models are significantly better than, the American foundation model labs at building something that's not only good, but also really cheap. And I think people really respect that. At the same time, a lot of people have competitive concern towards DeepSeek and Chinese models more generally, especially the competitive pressure, against the foundation model labs. I know that in the US, there's always the sense of, oh yeah, it's impressive engineering, but it's also not transformational yet. And then a lot of people are very, defensive about the DeepSeek, saying that numbers aren't real, or the Chinese models tend to exaggerate their performance on benchmarks. I think with the DeepSeek V4 release, I'm seeing a lot less of that and more of the congratulatory attitude towards the Chinese lab. So I think that's a positive sign.
Right. And what is the part that should worry US model companies the most? Is it benchmark performance, cost efficiency, long text capability, open weights, or hardware independence?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I definitely think benchmark performance is not the, most concerning thing for American companies, just given that, benchmark performance are people always joke about benchmark performances and everyone's trying to inflate them. It's more like a marketing function than anything else. And also in terms of efficiency, I think it is really important. But at the same time, if OpenAI and Anthropic really doubles down on it, it's not something that they're not able to catch up on. I think the biggest risk of DeepSeek is that it creates a death zone or a kill line for foundation model companies in the US. We actually wrote about this earlier last year. The idea that open source models create a kill line for all foundation model companies, and the idea there is that or the AI business model is very binary. If you're a foundation model company and you get surpassed by open source company, the value of your business is essentially zero. If just an exercise, right? If Anthropic is not the best performing model in coding, who's going to use Claude Code, right? Where does Anthropic's revenue, go down to? And what should Anthropic's valuation go down to? So it's a survival question for foundation model companies in the US. DeepSeek is holding a gun behind their back, right? If these companies don't run fast enough, DeepSeek is going to catch up to them and just really, really destroy their business.
Right. So do you see DeepSeek as a short-term competitive pressure or a sign of a more structural shift in the AI market? So what is the biggest lesson that Silicon Valley should take from DeepSeek?
I definitely see it more as a structural shift, and it'll leave Silicon Valley soul searching for a while. And I think what DeepSeek shows is that efficiency is a form of intelligence, right? For the longest time, Silicon Valley companies have obsessed over smarter models, and these labs have been underinvesting in algorithmic efficiency for the longest time, just because their business model actually encourages them to charge users more for models instead of really driving algorithmic efficiency. I think it's really interesting because DeepSeek V4 and OpenAI's GPT 5.5 actually came out on the same day. And then V4 is so cheap compared to all the other models that have a similar level of intelligence. And GPT 5.5 is actually twice as expensive as GPT 5.4. So you can clearly see that, DeepSeek is taking a very different approach compared to the big labs in the US. And I think the lesson here is that efficiency is a part of intelligence. I actually think because of newer frameworks and harnesses harnesses, such as OpenClaw, the capabilities of mid-tier models, such as DeepSeek, right? And such as the other open source models in China that they're not the top three models yet, but these models' capabilities are significantly, better released as a result of model harnesses. And I definitely had that feeling that, oh, because of, OpenClaw, frameworks like OpenClaw, I have a use case, or I have like a better ways of making use of less capable models that are a lot cheaper. So I think, I think like people are increasingly realizing that efficiency is a really big component in the usability of AI.
Right. As you mentioned that DeepSeek and other Chinese open source models like Kimi are now showing that open source models can catch up very, very quickly, right? They're not the best, but good enough and much, much cheaper. So how does that change the competitive landscape for companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, as well as Google Gemini? What does that do to the pricing power of the frontier model companies?
Yeah, one thing that we have data on this internally at our fund. We look at the data of the frontier models released by OpenAI and Anthropic and Google Gemini, and then we also look at the pricing power of second tier models that are released by these companies. And one trend that we're seeing over and over and over again is that whenever you have an open source model, the pricing power of the second tier models gets slashed, right? There's still significant pricing power, and when it comes to state of the art models, and whenever like an open source equivalent comes around, like OpenAI simply cannot charge that much for its earlier models, and the same goes for Anthropic. Now it's really interesting because in Silicon Valley for the longest time people would believe that a lot of companies are willing to pay for the extra intelligence, right? So even if like GPT 5.5 or Opus 4.6, 4.7 are really, really expensive, there's still a lot of roles where you require the best intelligence and the more expensive models to do, and a lot of American companies are willing to pay that price. However, I think as open source models like DeepSeek get better, I think in the next like 12 months or so, there's going to be an inflection point where the marginal value of additional intelligence is not there anymore, right? Like if DeepSeek V5 or V6 can achieve the performance of an Opus 4.6, then maybe there's very little utility in having a smarter model, especially if I'm doing just, like normal enterprise tasks.
Right. Also, I think DeepSeek represents a path which model companies seek extreme token efficiency, cost efficiency, and computing optimization, right? So is this a different path from Silicon Valley model companies who are now raising hundreds of billions of dollars to chase AGI, and which is a right path in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't think there's a dichotomy here. I think in every industrial revolution is not just about how good the technology is, it's also about how cheap it is, right? Like the types of technologies that are able to drive change are the ones that are cheap enough for people to use them. Like sometimes when I'm using Opus 4.6 for coding tasks or in my OpenClaw, I always ask myself, is it really worthwhile paying $200 a day for something that I can, just use a human and maybe do it even more cheaply, right? So I think in order to achieve AGI, especially in order to achieve AGI that's useful for like the masses, we definitely need a model that's intelligent enough and also cheap enough. And I think the question to whether, like the DeepSeek approach or the OpenAI and Anthropic approach is right, really depends on whether scaling continues to yield intelligence gains. And there's some debate around that, especially if you look at the cost, right? And if scaling returns diminish, proportional to the cost, I think DeepSeek's approach will seem really smart in hindsight in the future.
Great, great. And let's talk about some of the top model companies here in the Silicon Valley. First of all, I want to ask about Anthropic. So Anthropic has recently received a lot of attention for its growth, enterprise traction, valuation momentum as well. What is driving Anthropic's rise in Silicon Valley right now?
I think it's basically three things. I think Claude Code definitely is a defining moment for Anthropic, even though Anthropic's previous models were already good enough in coding, but I do think its first party product, Claude Code, is what's driving most of the revenue for Anthropic. I think the second thing for Anthropic is enterprise trust. I have a lot of enterprises within our network, and a lot of them say that like they just trust Anthropic's models more because they have like a commitment towards safety, and also the whole Anthropic versus the Pentagon thing. A lot of enterprises they bought into Anthropic's like messaging there. And I think the third part is that Anthropic vis-a-vis OpenAI, like Anthropic just seemed like the adult in the room, whereas like OpenAI was going through so much chaos personnel wise. That's why a lot of enterprises decided to go with Anthropic. And even like within, a small fund like us, we're using Anthropic instead of, ChatGPT. And the reason is that we think Anthropic's models genuinely perform a lot better compared to ChatGPT in work-related tasks. And initially when Anthropic was releasing their first models back in like, 2021, 2022, and even like till I say like 2023, Anthropic was really struggling to find product market fit. And the reason is that in the very early days of LLMs, like the main product was the chatbot. And Anthropic doesn't really have the consumer DNA or the ability to ship really quickly given their security culture. Like because they didn't have that, they were always, like lagging behind OpenAI. And now in the world of enterprise AI adoption, as well as AI coding, I think Anthropic is finding their product market fit and overtaking OpenAI as like the number one company in AI in the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think Anthropic's valuation in the secondary market surpassed OpenAI, reaching $1 trillion, right? Why is that? Like, what happened for the tipping point?
Yeah, it's really interesting because last summer we actually did a 10,000 word deep dive on OpenAI. And one of our biggest takeaways from that deep dive is that OpenAI is trying to build an everything platform. It's trying to become everything for everyone. Now, I think it's that strategy that actually made OpenAI lose its technical lead vis-a-vis Anthropic. OpenAI had a hardware division. They were trying to build their own chips. They were trying to build a shopping app. Like the core ChatGPT experience was just not there. And that's why, like, since late last year, OpenAI has been doubling down on the core experience and just like cutting a lot of like side projects, including Sora. Whereas Anthropic has always been super, super focused. It's always been focused on safety. It's always been focused on like, enterprise related tasks. And I think the focus on coding is also really smart because I think coding really is the most important step towards AGI. Like whoever owns coding probably will be the dominant player in AGI as well.
Yeah, I totally get it. I mean, like coding is important. I get it. But does winning the coding market mean winning the AGI race? I mean, you still have the chatbot, you have the like text to video, you have the multimodality, right? Why is coding so important?
I remember reading this article from Peter Steinberger, the founder of OpenClaw. And the article title was something like Claude Code is my computer, right? And the idea is that like he's basically using Claude Code to control his computer before he started OpenClaw and before like you had a consumer interface to access the model's capabilities. So I guess, like most tasks that you run on a computer is a coding task, but whether it is video editing, whether it is, website design, like everything you do on a computer fundamentally is a coding task. And that's why like coding is such an important landscape for AI companies to compete in. And also unlike other use cases, coding is very measurable. Like it's, like it's very easy to see if it's succeeding or failing. And also you have an insane amount of data. And plus like, and engineers are usually the first to adopt a new technology. And that's why with all of those combined, coding is the perfect first task for AI models to tackle on its way to AGI.
Right. So I think Anthropic has not released any video models or image models as of now, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Do you think they will totally give up that multimodality race, or they will somehow one day come up with the multimodality models? Or they will just
Yeah.
achieve that simply by coding?
I think on the multimodality side, I think Anthropic is it's less likely for Anthropic to go after video just because I think like ByteDance is, for sure going to be the lead player in video, right? If you look at like the amount of video data, like ByteDance has way more data than anyone else. Even if you look at Google, like Google has way more video data than OpenAI or Anthropic. Like I remember this was early 2024 when Sora just came out and people were saying that like, oh my God, OpenAI just came out with Sora. It's so amazing. It was so mind-blowing at the time. time. And my initial reaction towards it is that this feels like a side project at OpenAI, especially given that OpenAI doesn't really have the amount of data that it needs to, create a really big and useful AI video model. And, 2 years later, OpenAI basically cut that project. And I think it's not, I don't really see a reason why Anthropic would want to do that on its own. Like why Anthropic would want to go after the multimodal models on its own, unless there's a particular strategic reason for it to do so. I know for a fact there are some explorations in like other fields like world models as well as like robotics, but I just think that like video generation is so far from Anthropic's core competency that like maybe they don't really want to distract themselves by doing that. I have friends who are early employees at XAI, and one of their complaints that they, told me repeatedly is that Elon changes his mind every other day. He sees a new model come out from OpenAI or from, Google, and they're like, why don't we have the same, right? That's why they went after coding, they went after image generation and video generation. They have like a gazillion different things. And I think that kind of distraction is part of the reason why XAI is really struggling to keep up with the frontier model race today.
Right. So maybe the key for Anthropic's success is that they're so focused. They just focus on coding, while OpenAI wants to do everything. And although I think they canceled Sora app, but they still maintain the video team, right? But I heard they actually combine the team with the robotics team. So probably they will use the video model for the world model to train the robotics.
Yeah, 100%. I think like it makes total sense for them to do that, especially if the goal is AGI. I don't think like video as its own team, especially for like design or like creative work. I don't think that's the way that you do it, especially if you want to have like a main goal. And for OpenAI, the goal is to build AGI, and I think that's the same for Anthropic.
Right. And OpenAI actually released a GPT 5.5 on the same day when
Yes.
DeepSeek released before. I heard a very positive feedback from the developer community. What does it mean for the battle between OpenAI and Anthropic? So does that make OpenAI feel better?
Yeah, I think between the top three labs in the US, like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, the gap between these three companies has never been huge, right? People always, I think in Silicon Valley, people have FOMO and people always think that like there's a clear winner in AI. I remember like a year ago, it was all about OpenAI. It was all about like how amazing OpenAI's models are and how far behind everyone else is and how OpenAI is going to become the next like, like the next Google, right? And then the narrative like 6 months ago or like a little over 6 months ago was that Gemini is the clear winner. And then, the last like 3 months or so, or maybe a little longer than that, the narrative has been like, oh, Anthropic is the biggest winner, right? So like the, number one keeps flipping between these model companies, and therefore, like, the conclusion might be that there's no clear single winner who's able to maintain a lead for more than a year. And I think the gap between these model companies are actually relatively small. Like if one company just, loses a step, right? It's gonna like, it's gonna fall behind. If another company just like gets their shit together and just really like pulls ahead, they're able to do that. And I think with GPT 5.4 even, I thought it was a really powerful model in cybersecurity. And then for 5.5, I think this is again OpenAI trying to be back on the offense in enterprise after being distracted for a really long period. And I have heard a lot of really great things about GPT 5.5. However, a lot of people are complaining about the cost as well, which is why, models like DeepSeek still play a role in the developer community.
Yeah. I think 5.5 is super expensive, right? But
It's
it
really
was
expensive.
especially the Pro. I remember for the long text one was like 180 per million tokens, if I remember correctly. That's
I think so, yeah.
yeah, right. So as you mentioned, 5.5 has a very strong emphasis on real world capabilities such as coding, research, data analytics, document creation, and tool use. What does that tell you about where the US SOTA models are heading to?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting question. I forgot to mention this in an earlier question about OpenAI versus Anthropic's valuations. And I think one of the reasons why Anthropic is valued a lot higher compared to OpenAI today, because OpenAI is actually trading below its its last round valuations, and then Anthropic is trading way above its last round valuations. And part of the reason is that Anthropic has a very clean enterprise a focus. Like its revenue is very heavily concentrated in enterprise, and for U.S. investors, enterprise revenue is seen as stickier, is seen as higher quality, and also like it expands the TAM for the company as well, right? U.S. investors historically have preferred enterprise revenue over consumer revenue, especially given that OpenAI's revenue predominantly comes from the ChatGPT subscription. Now, I think OpenAI is definitely being on the offensive in terms of going after enterprises, and I've heard a lot of companies receiving pitches from the OpenAI. I think OpenAI Frontier, that's their enterprise product. So I think ahead of their IPOs, OpenAI and Anthropic definitely want to position their revenue as like predominantly enterprise and then only secondarily consumer. And especially for a company like OpenAI, that's what they want to do. And in order to do that, they need to make their models perform well on a real world tasks instead of just benchmarks, right? Historically, OpenAI has been the company that focused a lot on benchmark performance, whereas Anthropic has been, a lot more chill about benchmark performance, but they care a lot more about real world performance. And I think it's positive for everyone that these foundation model companies are giving up benchmarks or giving up their sole focus or their obsession with benchmarks and just focusing a lot more on real world performance and tasks.
And what happened to XAI and Meta? Can they still catch up?
Yeah, I really think that, foundation models, the foundation model business is a very tough business, right? As I mentioned, there's a huge kill line that's created by DeepSeek. And as open source models are getting better and better, it's going to be harder and harder for closed source models to compete. I think for Meta specifically, in the last month or so, they released a new model called MuseSpark, and a lot of people are saying, oh, this is a great sign that Meta is making a comeback and, they're actually doing something with the new super intelligence team. But after digging into the model, I don't think it is commercially differentiated vis-a-vis the other open source models out there. I don't even think it's differentiated vis-a-vis I don't know, second tier models from from OpenAI or Anthropic. And that's why I think it's going to be pretty hard for them to really, pull ahead. However, there's a very controversial recent initiative that Meta is pursuing, which is the Model Capability Initiative, where they are rolling out internal tracking, on their own employees. And it's very, very controversial because Meta employees are yeah, I don't want to become training data for Meta's AI model. But I actually think this is ironically one of the only ways for Meta to have a data mode when it comes to coding or agentic tasks. And interestingly, over the last 2 or 3 months, I've heard a few pitches from startups on, that want to do exactly the same thing, which shows that foundation model labs want this kind of telemetric, computer use data for model training. So I think maybe this is the right approach for Meta. Maybe this is going to help them create an edge, but I still think it's very, very competitive. And I think they're already behind and I'm not sure what their internal strategy is. And then for XAI, I think it was very chaotic, over the last year or so, given all the, Elon's temperament changes, him being very distracted, team being very distracted with different product decisions. Very interestingly, I actually invested in an early XAI employee who got fired by Elon because, he was fighting back on some of his boss's requests. But I think there's more to be desired in terms of their organizational focus as well. I think it's still the best tool in terms of querying real-time data on Twitter. But beyond that, I really don't use Grok very much for any other use case.
So do you think in the US, other open source models would have a chance to compete with the Chinese open models? How about Reflection AI?
I have to be harsh here. I actually don't think they have a chance, including for, Meta's Llama models. I just in terms of the open source models that I use, almost 100% of them are Chinese. I sometimes will use Llama models, but the vast majority of them are Chinese models. I think the Chinese developers are very smart to open source all their models, including their model architecture. Not only does this encourage open source development around the world, but also because they are they're not the top tier models out there. They're not the frontier models. models. I think in that case, right, it makes sense for them to like just open source everything, have people adopt it, and just like have the community give them feedback on their model performance and just iterate really, really quickly. So I think it's going to be very hard for a US company to outcompete the Chinese companies, especially given that like there's so much development, the cadence, like of new model iteration is just incredible.
Right, but do you think the Chinese open source models are going to chip away GPT or Claude's revenues?
I think if you ask these companies, then the answer is definitely no, right? But if you just think rationally for yourself, the answer is definitely yes. Because if you look at the mix of models that people are using, if you ask them like what models you're using for your AI products, I would say like 80% of their tasks are run on a combination of smaller open source models, and only 20% of the most intellectual or sophisticated tasks are run on closed source models, right? So I think definitely open source models are chipping away at foundational models revenue. Like I wouldn't go as far as to say like, OpenAI or Anthropic is going to be dead because of DeepSeek, but I do think like open source models like DeepSeek is one of the biggest structural threats to the closed source business model in the US.
Cool. And I think Anthropic and OpenAI are going public this year, right? How's the sentiment in the capital market, in your opinion? You feel like the money is waiting for them, or people think their valuation has been too high? How do you think the IPOs will be?
Yeah, I think just going back to my earlier comment about OpenAI and Anthropic's business, their revenue breakdown, I think there is way more appetite for Anthropic than there is for OpenAI, and I think that's the consensus right now. When I talk to public investors, right, everyone wants to get access to Anthropic, and it's interesting because a lot of people that are buying Anthropic secondaries today are actually hedge funds and public market investors because they think the stock will pop on the public market, given that the revenue is growing really aggressively. And I think the sentiment is very different for OpenAI. A lot of institutions are selling OpenAI. Even like within my network, I get asked whether I'm buying OpenAI on like a daily basis. Someone's like, "Oh, we have a 10 million chunk of OpenAI. Is your fund buying, or do you know anyone who's buying OpenAI?" So it just shows that a lot of institutions are trying to sell OpenAI ahead of the IPO. And I think OpenAI definitely need to like fix its spending problem. We actually have an internal chart on OpenAI versus Anthropic's efficiency and spending, and you can see that for the same amount of revenue that Anthropic is generating, it's significantly more capital efficient compared with OpenAI. Like OpenAI has just procured way too much compute. And just it's spending way too much, especially on infrastructure, before its revenue has grown to that level.
That's interesting. Like, why has OpenAI spent much more than Anthropic on the computing?
I think a big part of it is the philosophy. Like Anthropic, throughout the company's history, they've always exercised restraint. Since day one, they were very careful about like, not overly committing themselves to GPU and infrastructure spending. They don't really want to be in a situation where like, if the revenue doesn't catch up, they are beholden to a bunch of GPU purchases. They don't really want to be in that situation. Whereas OpenAI has always been a move fast, break things, and just expand really quickly kind of company. And they've been a lot more aggressive from day one. This is a guess, this is just my personal guess. I actually think ahead of the IPO, there might be like investor pressure on OpenAI to like change a CEO, because like Sam is not someone who's very like stingy. Like he doesn't save money, let's just put it that way. And I think a lot of investors are not happy about his spending habits when it comes to like infrastructure investments.
One more DeepSeek question. So, does DeepSeek actually prove that scaling alone is not enough? While, for OpenAI, you have to think about the efficiency, you have to think about the compute, right? With the pressure from the investors from the IPO.
Yeah, I would even reframe it as like DeepSeek has, I think the main thing that DeepSeek has shown is that efficiency is really important. And I think that's like a lesson that Silicon Valley keeps keeps forgetting. And I think the reason why DeepSeek is able to get to such efficiency is because it's in an environment where it doesn't have the infrastructure or the chips that Silicon Valley companies have, right? Like sometimes I even joke with people that Silicon Valley AI companies have too much cash, and because they have so much cash, they don't have an incentive. They're not put in an environment where they have to think about efficiency, and that's why like DeepSeek has a structural advantage there, in showing that like, hey, we can do things much more efficiently, and I think that's the biggest advantage that DeepSeek has vis-a-vis the foundation model companies in the US. But at the same time, right, I wouldn't say that like because of DeepSeek, because of the architectural improvements, it shows that the scaling law is no longer applying to AI. I actually think from an investor's perspective, investors almost don't really care about whether the scaling law is working or not. I think the real question is at what cost, right? What is the marginal benefit of like an additional $1 billion, $10 billion investment? Like how much better does it make the model? Like how much additional TAM or how much additional like revenue can you generate with that model performance? I think like a few years ago it was a very different mindset like among US investors, and the mindset a few years ago is like, hey, this thing's still growing. We're still on an exponential curve, so we're gonna put more capital into it. But like I think in today's day and age, the question is very different. Like the question is like, even if we do put more capital into it, what's the ROI? And I think unfortunately, right, the foundation model companies are forced to IPO because they really don't have that many other pools of capital to tap into. They have to tap into the capital markets to continue to fuel their capital spend, right? Especially at like a company for OpenAI. If you look at the last few rounds of fundraising, it's almost out of desperation. They were going after the Saudis, they're going after private equity funds. Like they're trying to get every little piece of capital, every bit of, every drop of capital that they can. So I really want to reframe it as an ROI question. And I think DeepSeek shows that maybe there's a different way of doing things, right? Maybe the ROI for scaling the models or, for scaling infrastructure really isn't there anymore.
Right. And interestingly, DeepSeek is raising money as well. So of course, DeepSeek is raising in the Chinese market. In terms of valuation, how do you think the open source model companies will be valued? Will they be valued differently from the OpenAI and also Anthropic, those kind of closed models?
Yeah, I think AI foundation model companies go through two phases in their valuation. Like in phase one, you're buying the story, you're buying the team, you're buying the methodology or the tech, right? And I think DeepSeek is absolutely in that phase. And this is the phase that OpenAI and Anthropic were in back in 2022 and 2023 when people were like really buying the dream. They think that this company has a unique approach, it's going to do something special. Whereas like OpenAI and Anthropic are in phase two of foundation model valuations, which is the phase where investors start asking, hey, what's your revenue, right? What's your retention? What's your burn? Like, they start to ask about financial metrics. I think it's still going to be a few years before DeepSeek enters that phase, which is why I think the valuation today almost doesn't really matter. It's just like a number on a paper, right? Like it's more about like how much capital does it take for this company to go to the next stage? That matters a lot more than like how much is this company actually worth? But I think it's really smart for DeepSeek to raise capital at this particular moment because I think it's a really good opportunity for them to build an ecosystem, right? I'm sure you and the previous guest talked about it as well. Like DeepSeek is very deeply integrated in the Huawei Ascend ecosystem, just the same way that OpenAI is integrated with Microsoft and Anthropic is integrated with AWS. That kind of integration gives DeepSeek a once in a lifetime opportunity to build an ecosystem around its models, around its infrastructure, and just like really rebuild the Chinese AI ecosystem around like domestically produced chips. And I think that's why it's so smart for DeepSeek to do a fundraise at this moment.
Right. But they have to go through phase two as well.
Yes,
And
yes,
they have to show their product.
yes, absolutely.
Great. I think those are all my questions. Is there anything else you want to add?
I think that's about it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Jenny.